Nobody expects a visit to their family's cemetery to become the fight of their life. I certainly didn't. I had made the drive dozens of times over the years. The same quiet road cutting to the edge of an upscale golf community in the south. The same wrought iron boundary markers coming into view. The same particular stillness that settles over a piece of land when generations of your family are buried in it. My great-grandfather had purchased the property more than a century ago, and every generation since had added to it, maintained it, and passed it forward as something sacred, not valuable in any commercial sense. Sacred in the only sense that actually matters, the kind of place where people go to remember who they come from. I had been away on business for several weeks when I made the drive back. The moment I turned toward the cemetery, something felt wrong in a way that things feel wrong before you can fully articulate why. Then I got close enough to see the equipment. Heavy machinery was working the land bordering the cemetery with the indifferent efficiency of a project already well underway. Excavators, drainage installation crews, a crew reshaping the landscape with the confidence of people operating on an approved timeline. My first thought was that they were working adjacent to property, close, maybe uncomfortably close, but not on it. That thought lasted about 30 seconds. When I walked the boundary line, the reality of what happened hit me with the specific, nauseating force of something that shouldn't be possible but unmistakably is. Several grave markers had been displaced from their original positions. Sections of perimeter fencing were missing entirely. Fresh construction tracks cut across ground that had remained undisturbed for decades, ground where my family members were buried. The crews moved around me with the focused momentum of people who had been told this area was cleared and available, which meant that somewhere up the chain of this project, someone had made a decision about land they did not own and had not verified. I found a site supervisor and asked for an explanation. He told me the HOA had approved a golf course expansion and that contractors had been informed the area was available for development. He said it with the straightforward delivery of someone repeating information he had been given and had no reason to doubt. That detail, the way the assumption had been passed down intact from whoever originated all the way to the people operating the equipment, told me immediately how deep this problem went. I called the HOA president that afternoon. Her response was something I still think about when I need a reminder of how institutional confidence can become completely untethered from institutional accountability. She told me the project had received proper approvals. She suggested the expansion would increase property values throughout the community. She spoke about the development in the pleasant, forward-looking language of someone presenting a neighborhood improvement. And she did all of this without once producing a single document demonstrating that the HOA had any ownership claim or legal authority over the land her contractors were actively disturbing. When I pressed her on that specific point, the conversation grew noticeably shorter. I went home and pulled every document I had. What I found over the next several days was not ambiguous. The cemetery property was protected by multiple recorded agreements predating the golf community entirely. Ownership had never transferred. Access rights and boundary protections were clearly established in county records. Historical preservation agreements existed at both the local and county level, the kind that don't get superseded by HOA expansion plans regardless of what approvals the board believes it has obtained. The HOA had no authority over this land, not partial authority, not arguable authority, no authority of any kind. The construction that had already begun was not a misunderstanding at the edges of a complicated legal situation. It was a straightforward violation of clearly documented private property. The deeper I went into the project records, the worse the picture became. Construction plans have been drawn up referencing assumptions about land availability rather than verified ownership documentation. Several county approvals have been issued on the basis of incomplete information submitted during the application process. Property boundary coordinates that were part of the public record appeared to have been ignored entirely during the planning phase. At some point in the development of this project, someone had made a decision, or more likely a series of small, individually unremarkable decisions that added up to breaking ground on a private, legally protected, historically documented family cemetery without ever confirming who owned it. I organized everything into a comprehensive file and submitted copies to county officials with a formal written account of what had been found on site. The response was not the slow bureaucratic process I had prepared myself for. A formal review was opened quickly. County inspectors visited the property. Licensed surveyors verified the boundary lines against recorded documents. Historical records were pulled and examined against the construction permits that had been issued. Every independent review reached the same conclusion through the same evidence. The cemetery was privately owned, legally protected, and had been actively disturbed by a development project that had no authorization to touch it. When those findings became part of the public record, the community conversation changed completely and rapidly. Residents who had supported the golf course expansion as a straightforward neighborhood improvement began realizing they had been given an incomplete version of events. Nobody had told them the land in question was a private family cemetery with a century of documented history and multiple layers of recorded legal protection. Nobody had mentioned that the ownership question had apparently never been seriously investigated before machinery was deployed. Questions spread through neighborhood meetings with the momentum that questions develop when people feel they have been asked to endorse something without being given the relevant facts. The HOA leadership had no satisfying answers, because there are no satisfying answers to how something like this happens. The honest version, that assumptions were made, that verification was skipped, that the project moved forward on the institutional confidence of an organization that had not done its homework, is not the kind of explanation that reassures a community. What followed over the subsequent months was a reckoning that went well beyond the construction project itself. Oversight procedures were formally reviewed and revised. Accountability structures that had existed only on paper were given actual enforcement mechanisms. Leadership positions changed as residents, now paying much closer attention, demanded that the people making decisions on behalf of the community demonstrate that they were capable of making them responsibly. The golf course expansion, the project that was supposed to add amenity and value to an already affluent community, became instead the most expensive lesson in due diligence the HOA had ever received. Costly in money, in reputation, and in particular institutional credibility that takes years to build and can be lost in the span of a single poorly verified approval. The cemetery was restored. The markers were returned to their positions. The boundary was reestablished and documented with updated surveys filed with the county. The land looks today as it should look, as it looked before anyone decided, without asking or verifying or apparently even wondering that it was available. My great-grandfather bought that ground when this part of the South was a very different place. He chose it deliberately, recorded it properly, and understood that some things need to be put in writing precisely because the people who come after you may not know the history. He was right about that in ways he couldn't have anticipated. The documents he filed outlasted every assumption that was made about his land more than 100 years later, and they were ultimately what brought it back. There's a version of this story where I came home from that business trip, saw the equipment, felt overwhelmed by the scale of what had already been done, and decided the fight wasn't worth it. Property rights don't defend themselves. Recorded agreements don't enforce themselves. History doesn't preserve itself. Every one of those things requires someone willing to stand in front of a piece of land and say clearly, with documentation in hand, that this place belongs to someone and that someone did not give you permission to be here. That's not a complicated position. It just requires the willingness to hold it. Some places are not development opportunities. Some boundaries are not negotiable.